Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the way the United States perceives Israel versus the way the United States perceives the Palestinians. A larger number of Democratic voters in the United States than ever before view Palestinians more favorably than they view Israel. This is the first time ever shift in preference, and it's a shocker. Here are the numbers, and it's important to concentrate just on the numbers. 49% to 38%. That means 49% of the 1,008 Democrats polled by telephone between February 1st and February 23rd viewed Palestinians as better than Israelis, and 38% viewed Israelis better than Palestinians. These hard truths are difficult to conceive of, even more difficult to understand. For Israelis, this is a new reality, and it's nothing short of earth-shattering. All the good, all the contributions that Israel makes to the world, and especially the United States, compared to the Palestinians, is minimized, discounted, discredited, ignored. How could these voters, these Americans, be more favorably inclined to Palestinians than they are to Israelis? In truth, these numbers were inevitable. The arrival of this day was predictable. It was simply a matter of time before Gallup or another pollster would deliver the bad news. The good news is, and there is good news, and that is that not all is lost. 49% of those polled may favor Palestinians over Israelis, but 56% of Democrats still view Israel favorably. The better news is that when you add the Republicans, and when they're asked about Israel, a whopping 82% responded that they view Israel favorably. And overall, Americans have a 68% favorable view of Israel. Now, over the past year, there has been a massive drop in favorability of Israel in the eyes of Democrats. That should be clear. Last year, it was nearly even. 40% Israelis, 38% for Palestinians. This year, there is an 11-point spread. A decade ago, the spread was 58-19 in favor of Israel. Speaking defensively, there are those who still claim that voters aside Democratic leadership is still in Israel's court, and that is correct. But I do not deny that claim. I will clearly point out, though, that we are witnessing a deep-seated anti-Israel sentiment from many of those who are very comfortable in the Democratic Party. Even more, because the move away from Israel is so predominant and widespread among millennials, that is, younger people, aka our future, one cannot but worry about what is favorably and what the favorability quotient will be a decade from now. There is a reason for this popularity gap, and it is loyalties are changing because Israel is changing, and because America, too, is changing. Portrayal of Israel in the United States media over the past 4 months has been extremely negative. Despite the great things that Israel does, and they do great things like international life-saving measures, Israelis undertaking to save even their enemies, those are not the stories played out in the media in the United States. There are two news stories emanating out of the Jewish state that have captured U.S. media attention and careen across headlines and op-ed pages. Number one, an extremist Israeli government, and number two, judicial reform. Both storylines, whether actually true or not, portray Israelis as breaking down the democratic fabric of Israel. Neither one depicts Israel as responding adequately to these issues. Neither mollifies the images of Israel. If anything, Israel leadership has thrown oil on the fire. Israeli leadership has fueled the flames of the perception that they are moving towards extremism and that Israel is an erosion of the foundations of their democracy. And that democracy includes minority rights. It includes the rights of Palestinians and the rights of the LGBTQ in that community. Media in the United States portrays the government of Israel as being influenced by anti-democratic forces, with members of that government publicly announcing that an entire Palestinian city should be destroyed, where a minister in charge of the police publicly fires the police chief for not quelling political demonstrations against him, where the Attorney General says this is all illegal, and then he calls for her firing. It does not take much to imagine that this will be seen as this scenario plays out in the United States. And it is not just the United States. It's in Europe too. During Prime Minister Netanyahu's state visit to Germany, these accusations plagued him at nearly every stop along the trip. There is good cause to worry. Worry about extremism. Worry that if the Supreme Court is neutered, extremists will gain more power. Worry that if extremists gain more power, Israel, the democracy, will move toward Israel, the authoritarian regime. For a long time, loyalty and support of Israel was bipartisan in the United States. It was an issue that simply reached across the aisle. And there was wall-to-wall support. Few other things in Washington were like that. The balance was always a seesaw, but it was balanced. In the end, it balanced. There was a time when Republicans were more skeptical about Israel and Democrats were over the top in love with Israel. And then we see a shift. But never to this extent. Never like this. Never would I have imagined that Israeli leaders would be advocating and articulating ideas that are so antithetical to the Israel of today, so antithetical to the Hebrew expression, Eretz Yisrael Hayafa, Israel the beautiful. Stable democracies, you should know, change very slowly. Fast change signals revolution. My advice for Israeli leadership is to be careful of dramatic change. Think moderation. Follow the Maimonidean, the Rambam approach, the Aristotelian principle of Shvil HaZahav, the middle road, the golden mean. That's when Americans and Europeans will once again see the real Israel. That's when Israel once again will be favorably viewed in the United States and in Europe. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from the Associated Press, and it was published on March 16th, 2023. The AP analysis is never signed, so I am often wary to use them, but I believe that names are important, that's why I do it. But in this case, opinion pieces should have names, but in this case, I make an exception. So I use that as context to my analysis. Despite my reservations, I choose to use this unsigned piece because I thought it was worthy of discussion. The column is entitled, No White House Visit for Israel's Netanyahu, as U.S. Concern Rises. Subtitled, Analysis, Washington sends clear message to Israeli leader. If you pursue objectionable policies, there's no entitlement to the Oval Office sit-down, says expert. In the essay, the Associated Press very clearly explains where the United States stands and how Israel's Prime Minister, that is Netanyahu, is. And to put it bluntly, in a pickle. And this is how the AP piece begins. 11 weeks into his third stint as Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu has yet to be received at the White House, signaling apparent U.S. unhappiness over the policies of his right-wing government. Most new Israeli leaders had visited the United States or met with the president by this point in their premierships, according to a Reuters review of official visits going back to the late 1970s. Only 2 out of 13 previous prime ministers heading a new government waited longer. It should be clear that there is a public message and a private message being announced here, and the AP is actually going to explain this. They continue. The White House declined to confirm Netanyahu has yet to be invited. A State Department spokesman referred Reuters to the Israeli government for information about the Prime Minister's travel plans. Israel's embassy in Washington declined to comment. The message they clearly want to send is, if you pursue objectionable policies, there's no entitlement to the Oval Office sit-down, said David Makovsky, a former senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, now at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. AP concludes by quoting former Ambassador Dennis Ross, trying to bring this to a point to explain exactly what's going on. And the AP's words, this is what they say. Biden's own personal instincts are such that it's very difficult for him to want to adopt an extremely tough posture towards Israel. Dennis Ross, a veteran U.S. Middle East peace negotiator, now at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, said, he would prefer to have the Middle East in a box so he can focus only on Russia, Ukraine, and China. Unfortunately, the Middle East has a way of imposing itself unless we initiate enough to try to manage the environment. As I said, the column is worth discussing. Coming up next is a column from the Jerusalem Post. It was published on March 19, 2023, and it was written by Robert M. Schwartz. The column is entitled, "What is the Root of the Israeli-Palestinian Impasse? Opinion?" and then subtitled, "The root of the Middle East problem is that the two parties hold fundamentally different ethical systems that make this impossible without a paradigm shift in conflict resolution strategies." That's the title. And it says really everything. In order to move towards peace, a whole paradigm shift has to take place between the Palestinians and the Israelis. In this essay, Schwartz does an excellent job of explaining that there is a synapse between Israeli and Palestinian understandings of the way the world works. Not just their understanding, the world in general. In his analysis, he leaves out the US, which is unfortunate. Had he included the US, it would be obvious that the US sees things in line with the way Israel does, not the way Palestinians view the world. Schwartz explains that because of their worldview, disparity and agreement between Israel and the Palestinians will be impossible to achieve unless, of course, and this is a big unless, there's a change in the paradigm. This is how Schwartz begins. I asked an articulate Arab Israeli why the Palestinians have rejected every compromise peace proposal since 1947. He repeated a firm mantra 3 times throughout our conversation. All or nothing, all or nothing, all or nothing. The historical events of the past 75 years suggest that this view of the Arab-Israeli street is not idiosyncratic, but a deeply rooted belief about conflict resolution. Recent talks in Aqaba and ongoing violence have sparked resumed calls pushing for a two-state solution. The Western institutions urging this need to hear an inconvenient truth. The root of the Middle East problem is that the two parties hold fundamentally different ethical systems that make this impossible without a paradigm shift in conflict resolution strategies. University of California professor Vladimir Leberev developed a game theory model to demonstrate that 2 distinct ethical systems characterize the value systems of Western and Eastern nations. The former, Soviet Union, exemplified the Eastern system, whereas the United States and Europe represent the Western. Now Schwartz explains the dramatic differences between the cultures and how Israelis versus Palestinians deal with conflict in general. And as a result, once one sees this, one can understand the chasm which is so big between the two parties. He continues, these differences between compromise versus confrontation and means versus ends are evident throughout the Israeli-Arab conflict. The Palestinians believe their ends are noble. Therefore, this justifies targeting civilians in battle, using their people as human shields, celebrating the intentional murder of civilians, and financially rewarding terrorists who murder non-combatants. That is extremely insightful. And Schwartz understands this, and hence he concludes by writing the following. Without this cultural shift, we can expect more misunderstanding and tragic loss of human life. As Abba Eban famously quipped, the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Much of the Arab world is compromising to create positive opportunities with Israel. As time passes, the Palestinian confrontational strategy of all or nothing leaves fewer satisfactory solutions. Without this paradigm shift, they may obtain nothing rather than all. While we know this to be the case, and this is important for us to understand, every once in a while, the world needs to be reminded. So thank you very much, Schwartz. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 5 cartoons and memes today. First up is a meme featuring the Beverly Hillbillies. They were the Clampett family from the 1960s TV sitcom about poor mountaineers who discovered the oil on their property and made their way to Beverly Hills, California.
Come and listen to my story about a man named Jed. A poor mountaineer barely kept his family fed. And then one day he was shooting at some food, and up through the ground come a bubbling crude oil, that is, black gold, Texas tea. Well, the first thing you know, old Jed's a millionaire. The kinfolk said, Jed, move away from there. Said, California is the place you ought to be. So they loaded up the truck and they moved to Beverly Hills, that is, swimming pools, movie stars. The Beverly Hillbillies.
There was Jeb, the dad, Granny, Ellie Mae, the beautiful daughter, and Jethro, the dim-witted son. This meme pokes fun at the crazy world of politics in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. The family is clearly touring D.C., and Jeb says to Granny, considering what we've seen here, Granny, Jethro is a genius. This next meme makes fun of masks and the crazy crime situation in New York City. The meme reads, the tables have turned. Due to New York City uptick in crime, if you wear a mask, no entry. That is funny. It truly is a different world. Next is a wonderful and very cute meme about noise. Two children are playing their trombones. The dog is watching and the caption reads, this dog never wants to hear anyone complain about his barking ever again. I can tell you from experience, listening to two inexperienced trombone players try to make music only makes a crazy amount of noise because the trombone is a slide. It's not valves. It's hard to get the right notes. This next meme is just hilarious. We've all seen or even worn marathon and running t-shirts that are sponsored by banks. This one is sponsored by SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, the California bank that was shuttered by the federal government recently. This shirt reads, SVB Bank, Run 23. If you ask me, it was more of a sprint than a marathon. This last meme is simply perfect for our world. Because we take pictures of everything all the time, and we're always posing, and we have selfies and selfie hands and stands and everything else. This meme is a picture of a dog, and the caption reads, when your dog poses for pictures better than you do. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Palestinian terror group Hamas praised a shooting attack in which an Israeli man was seriously wounded in the Palestinian West Bank town of Huwara. Hamas spokesman Hassam Qasem called the attack, quote, a natural response to the crimes of the occupation against the Palestinian people. He continued, the resistance in the West Bank is getting stronger, more persistent and more rooted, and all security forces cannot stop it or bypass it, unquote. One has to ask, how was it possible to publicly support attacks against innocent civilians? In this case, an innocent family driving in their car, the father, a dual citizen of both Israel and America, the United States, and an ex-Marine, managed, after being wounded, to shoot and wound his attacker, even though he was actually shot in the head himself. Iran and Saudi Arabia have begun to get cozy, cozier than actually expected, that is diplomatically speaking. They are reestablishing ties, and the Iranian government has offered a proposal to the Saudi Arabian government. According to the Iranian foreign minister, Iran has suggested 3 locations for a meeting at the foreign minister level. Iranian foreign minister Hussein Amir Abdulhanian told the news conference in Tehran that his country had agreed to the meeting. What he did not reveal, however, was the suggested locations or the timetable for the meeting. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad arrived in the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, for an official visit. On this trip, the Syrian president was accompanied by his wife, Asma al-Assad. Long isolated by the Arab world, more and more Arab states have signaled an openness to easing the isolation of Damascus, of the Syrian government itself. This visit was marked with more ceremony than the trip Assad paid to the UAE last year. Last year was Assad's first to an Arab state since the Syrian civil war began, get this, 12 years ago in 2011. During that war, Gulf states, including the UAE, backed the rebels fighting to overthrow Assad and his regime. That's why this is so eye-opening. Ahead of the Muslim holiday month of Ramadan, Egypt hosted Israeli and Palestinian officials in the resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh in a United States and Jordanian-backed effort to calm a surge of violence in the West Bank. The five-way meeting followed the February 26th U.S. brokered summit in Jordan, the first of its kind in years. That secured Israeli and Palestinian pledges to de-escalate tensions. The best of intentions aside, that summit did not end in success. It was challenged by factions on both sides and failed to halt the violence on the ground. Russian state media reported that President Vladimir Putin made a surprise visit to Mariupol. It was the Kremlin's leader's first trip to the Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine's Donbas region since the start of the war over a year ago. The visit to Mariupol came on the heels of an unannounced visit Putin paid to Crimea to mark the 9th anniversary of Russia's annexation of the peninsula from Ukraine. It was also 2 days after the International Criminal Court, the ICC, issued an arrest warrant for the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin. Egypt and Turkey took another step towards mending relations when Ankara's top diplomat visited Cairo for the first time since ties were ruptured about a decade ago and held talks with his Egyptian counterpart. Relations between the countries were severely strained in 2013. That was when Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, Egypt's then army chief, led an ouster of the Muslim Brotherhood's Mohammed Morsi, an ally of Ankara of Turkey. Since 2021, tensions between the two countries have gradually thawed. At a joint news conference with his Turkish counterpart, Egyptian Foreign Minister Sama Shukri said talks with Turkey on the possibility of restoring ties to the ambassadorial level would happen at, quote, the appropriate time, unquote. He termed the talks, quote, honest, deep, and transparent, unquote. North Korea claims that about 800,000 of its citizens volunteered to join or re-enlist in the nation's military to fight against the United States. According to North Korea's state newspaper, the 800,000 students and workers from around the country enlisted and re-enlisted in one single day. That, by the way, as an aside, is almost impossible to imagine. Just the bureaucracy required to do that. This rather impressive claim came after North Korea launched the Hwasong-17 intercontinental ballistic missile, the ICBM, in response to ongoing U.S.-South Korea military drills. North Korea fired the ICBM into the sea between the Korean peninsula and Japan, just hours before South Korea's president flew to Tokyo for a summit to discuss ways to counter a nuclear-armed North Korea. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that there are only a few musical instruments mentioned in the Bible? Earlier in the show, I talked about trombones. Brass instruments, as we know them, were developed in the 1400s, but really improved and perfected in the mid-1700s. String instruments are much older. We find them in the Bible, and in Greece, in Africa and Asia, all over. Same is the case with percussion instruments. It's important to recognize it's hard to find a true first or beginning for string and percussion instruments in their families. There are even cave paintings of string instruments and percussion instruments. That's really remarkable. So, what are the instruments mentioned in the Bible? The shofar is obvious, that's the ram's horn. There's also the metal horn, often referred to as the trumpet, the chatzotz. There's the lyre and there's the harp. The difference between the lyre and the harp was probably the number of strings. 7 or 10 strings. David, first the shepherd and then as king, played the lyre. He was known for his musicality. He was actually very musical. There were cymbals and bells, the tambourine. There were drums and rattles and wood clappers. Miriam, Moses' sister, played the tambourine as Moses led the Israelites out of the Red Sea. While this list does not add up to a large number of biblical instruments, there was certainly plenty of music in the Bible. Biblical poetry, especially the book of Psalms, were musical. And when sung or chanted, they were accompanied by these instruments. And as the temple was being built, when builders built and workers worked, they were serenaded by the musicians playing their instruments. That, by the way, is why those instruments are not allowed on the Sabbath, because they didn't build the temple on the Sabbath. And anything connected to the building of the temple is not permitted on the Sabbath. So thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.